Greetings, people from the planet Earth, or what's left of it. There's these strange creatures out there, sometimes referred to as human beings, who are burning down our cities. They're burning down our forests. And I'm going fast and trying to make a lot of videos about a topic that I enjoy because I'm afraid they'll burn down YouTube and I won't have any way of sharing information. So let's continue in our series. I talked about the word that many times, and I came to the conclusion in my small, bizarre mind that it's not really a relative pronoun. And I'll explain what I think it is later, okay? But now we look at a thing called the relative clause. That's what it's commonly called, or sometimes it's called adjective clause or defining clause. But my question is it really that relative clause or that adjective clause? Here's sample sentences. The book that is green is a classic, and the plant that died was a rose, the house that Jack built is sturdy, and the tree that remains standing is listing. In other words, it's still standing, but it's tilted. Now, are these really relative clauses, okay? Let's take one of the sentences. The plant that died was a rose, okay? Well, that, all right, if it's not a relative pronoun, it's something else, but it's very important because it's part of this so-called relative clause, all right? So what comes after that? The word died. Any words could come after the word that. And are they relative? Well, they must be relative or relevant to a degree because of the position of the word that. When we talked about the word that and the grammatical functions of that, and in most cases, 4 out of 5, the word that comes before the referent or the other word associated with it, okay? So, yes, something that comes after that is definitely relevant. It's important, or it wouldn't be there, because it's a strange position in the middle for the word that. The word that, okay, in between your head noun and the word or phrase that comes after it, all right? So it's definitely relative to some degree. But if we determine that the word that's not a relative pronoun, then the term relative clause would be a poor name for this structure. And you say, well, what is it if it's not a relative clause? Well, the other term used instead of relative clause would be adjective clause. So you say, is it an adjective clause? Well, an adjective modifies, describes, or names an attribute of. Okay? It modifies, describes, or names an attribute of. So, is this so-called clause functioning as an adjective? Well, the plant that died. You're telling the reader that the plant, it's a distinct plant that didn't die. In other words, as far as an adjective goes, you're not referring to a plant that habitually dies. It just doesn't die, and then later on it dies, and then later on it dies. So it's not really an adjective that died. It's just distinguishing between the plant that died and the ones that are still living. Okay, now here's another sample sentence. Okay, the wine that he ordinarily sells is out of stock. The wine that he ordinarily sells is out of stock. Well, the so-called clause, all right, adjective or relative, states that he ordinarily sells. Well, it doesn't really modify, describe, or name an attribute of the wine itself. You see? So I have a problem with the term adjective in adjective clause. Okay, you say, well, is the clause demonstrative? All right? Demonstrative means pointing out the one referred to and distinguishing it from others of the same class. All right? The plant that died was a rose, and the wine that he ordinarily sells is out of stock. Well, what this so-called clause does here and here is distinguish. In other words, to mark as separate or different, or it could mean to set above or apart from others. So here we went from relative, we thought, nah, it's not really a relative clause. And we said, nah, it's not really an adjective clause. And it is kind of demonstrative because it's distinguishing one thing from another or from others, okay? So now hold that thought. I used the word distinguishing. This is critical in this series of videos. It's critical. The ability for a word or phrase or clause to distinguish. And that's one of the main concepts that I kept in mind in doing this grammar thing over the past 30 years, is the ability to distinguish something, okay? So hold that thought. We're going to get to that in the next few videos. So, is it even really a clause? That's the big question. Relative clause. Is it even really a clause? Let's go back to our sample. The plant that died was a rose. So that used to be called a relative pronoun. This is your verb phrase. It's just a single verb. That's okay. All right, it's still a verb phrase. So you have here what they used to call a pronoun, and you have your verb, and that would be a clause. If indeed this were a relative pronoun, then this would be a clause, but it's not. Okay? It's the word that plus verb, so what is it? What the hang is it? Now let's take another sample sentence, all right, here. The house that Jack built is sturdy, all right? So you would have, in the traditional system, your relative pronoun, a subject, and a verb phrase. So you would have then, you would have a pronoun, all right? In the traditional sense, you would have a noun and a verb, and you would have an implied clause. Because what you really have is the word that plus noun plus verb, and you have to ask, well, it's only an implied clause. It's not a genuine clause. We're going to talk about genuine clauses in the next few videos. I'm going to tell you something that I'm pretty sure you haven't ever heard before. I mean, I doubt it. Okay, now, we see, we observe, we see, and we figure out some things, some basic things from this little bit of information, but we see some things that pop out. The relative clause format in the traditional sense, all right, two different examples, is not consistent. One could conceivably be referred to as a clause. By a bit of a stretch, you'd have to consider this an actual pronoun. And the other one is an implied clause. Okay? And the second thing we notice right away is in number 2, example number 2, all right, the relative, so-called relative clause is grammatically awkward. Pronoun, noun, verb, or that noun, verb. It is grammatically awkward. All right? So, you say, Joey, if it's not a relative pronoun, the word that, and the so-called clause is not a clause, what is it? In the next video, I'm finally going to get to it. I really, really like this, and I can't wait to share it because I think we're going to see something here, or you're going to see something that you have not heretofore seen. I'm going to use terms and show it in such a way that it might actually click. It might actually make sense. I hope so. So thanks for watching, and I hope those crazy people out there don't burn your house down. I'd like to talk and speak with you again. Good night.